There are moments in life that don't announce themselves. They don't arrive carrying answers. They don't feel extraordinary while they're happening. They pass through ordinary hours dressed as ordinary experiences, unnoticed by everyone, including the person living them. Only later do you realize that everything divided itself into two versions of your life, before that moment and after it. I've been thinking about that more than I probably should. Not because I'm searching for a memory, because I'm trying to understand why certain moments refuse to stay in the past. Most, most memories fade. The edges soften, details disappear. Eventually, they become stories you tell instead of places you can still feel. But some experiences don't behave that way. They don't become memories. They become architecture. They settle somewhere beneath everything else, wider, quietly holding up parts of you that didn't exist before they arrived. You don't notice it happening. You only notice that one day you no longer see the world from the same height. I've always believed that people misunderstand change. They imagine it as something dramatic, a decision, a confession, a goodbye, a beginning. But real change rarely introduces itself through events. It introduces itself through perception. You wake up one morning and nothing around you is different. The streets haven't moved. The sky hasn't changed its color. People still speak the same language. Your routines remain untouched. And yet, everything feels slightly unfamiliar. Not because the world transformed, because the person looking at it did. That's the kind of change that interests me. The invisible kind, the kind no one congratulates you for because no one notices it happened. It doesn't ask for attention. It simply rearranges the way your mind holds reality. I've spent years believing I understood myself. Not perfectly, no one ever does, but well enough to predict how I would respond to almost anything. I knew the thoughts I would keep private. I knew the conversations I would avoid. I knew which emotions deserved attention and which ones would disappear if I left them alone long enough. There was comfort in that certainty. Predictability has a strange way of feeling like safety. When you know your own patterns, life becomes manageable. You stop questioning every reaction. You stop wondering who you'll become tomorrow because you assume tomorrow will resemble today. It's an efficient way to exist, stable, organized, understandable, until something quietly proves that your understanding was incomplete, not incorrect, just unfinished. There's an uncomfortable feeling that comes with discovering parts of yourself you never realized existed. It isn't excitement, it isn't fear, it's something quieter, something closer to disbelief, as if you've been living inside the same house for years only to discover an entire floor hidden behind a wall you walked past every single day. The house didn't expand overnight, it was always there. You simply didn't know how much of it remained unexplored. That's what self-discovery actually feels like. Not finding something new, finding something that had been waiting patiently for you to notice it. I wonder how many people spend their entire lives walking through only a fraction of themselves. Not because they're unwilling to look deeper, because life rarely gives them a reason to. We become efficient versions of ourselves, functional, reliable, recognizable. We repeat habits until they resemble identity. Eventually, we stop asking whether we're acting from truth or simply from familiarity. There's a difference, a significant one. Familiarity can imitate authenticity so convincingly that most people never notice the substitution. We call ourselves honest because we've repeated the same opinions for years. We call ourselves independent because we've grown comfortable being alone. We call ourselves strong because we've survived difficult seasons. But repetition isn't proof. Sometimes it's only evidence that we've become fluent in one particular version of ourselves. That version may be real, or it may simply be practiced. I've questioned that more recently. Not because I suddenly distrust who I am, because I've realized certainty can become its own blindfold. The moment you believe you've fully understood yourself, curiosity disappears. Without curiosity, growth becomes accidental. Without growth, identity slowly hardens into routine. Routine is useful, necessary, even, but it has a quiet habit of convincing us that predictability and truth are the same thing. They aren't. Truth keeps moving. It changes shape every time you become capable of seeing more than you could yesterday. That's why some realizations feel almost unfair. They don't replace your previous understanding. They expand it until your previous understanding no longer feels complete. Imagine spending years learning a map, every road memorized, every destination familiar. Then someone hands you another map, not different, but larger. Suddenly, the routes you knew aren't wrong. They're simply part of something much bigger. That's what perspective does. It doesn't erase, it enlarges. And enlargement has consequences. Because once your awareness expands, shrinking it again becomes impossible. You can't unknow what you've recognized. You can't return to certainty after witnessing complexity. You can pretend. People do it all the time. They convince themselves nothing changed. They distract themselves with noise. Work, entertainment, obligations, anything that prevents the quiet from asking uncomfortable questions. But the quiet always waits obediently. It never argues. It never demands attention. It simply remains. And eventually, when the world becomes still enough, it speaks again. I've learned not to underestimate silence. Most people treat silence as absence. I've started wondering if silence is actually presence stripped of distraction. Maybe that's why it unsettles us. Without constant movement, there's nothing left to interrupt whatever truth has been waiting beneath our attention. Silence doesn't create honesty. It reveals whether honesty was already there. That's why some people avoid being alone, not because they dislike solitude, because solitude removes witnesses until the only person left to answer is themselves. There's nowhere to hide inside your own mind, only places you haven't visited yet. And eventually, every unopened door begins to feel heavier than the rooms you've already explored. To be continued. The strange thing about unanswered questions is that they don't disappear simply because you stop asking them. They adapt, they become quieter, less obvious. They settle beneath your routines and wait for moments when your attention is unguarded, a walk that lasts a little longer than usual, a room where everyone has already gone home. The few seconds before sleep finally arrives. That's when they return, not demanding answers, only reminding you that they still exist. I've started noticing how much of my life has been built around certainty, not because certainty is comforting, because uncertainty asks for something I was never taught to give. Patience. We live as though every meaningful thing should arrive complete, as though understanding should be immediate, as though clarity is a destination instead of a process. But the more I pay attention, the more I realize that almost everything important begins incomplete. A conversation, a purpose, a belief, even the image we carry of ourselves. None of it arrives finished. We spend years polishing versions of ourselves without noticing that the person doing the polishing is changing too. It's almost impossible to keep up. Every answer creates another question. Every certainty quietly becomes another beginning. Maybe that's why growth feels so exhausting. It isn't because we're carrying more. It's because we're constantly becoming someone who has to carry differently. There was a time when I believed strength meant remaining unchanged, standing firm, never bending, never allowing the world to rewrite what I had already decided about myself. I admired that version of strength. It looked solid, reliable, untouchable. Now I'm not so sure. Stone survives storms, but it also never learns from them. Water appears fragile, yet over enough time it reshapes mountains. Perhaps resilience has less to do with resisting change and more to do with surviving it without losing your center. That thought has stayed with me because I've realized I spent years protecting myself from experiences that might alter the way I thought. Not dangerous experiences, just unfamiliar ones, different perspectives, unexpected conversations, moments that refused to fit inside the categories I had already created. It felt responsible, it felt disciplined. In reality, it was fear wearing the clothes of logic. Fear rarely introduces itself honestly. It calls itself preparation. It calls itself caution. It calls itself wisdom. Sometimes it truly is. Sometimes it's simply another name for refusing to step beyond what feels predictable. The difficult part is learning the difference. No one can teach it to you. You discover it by noticing which decisions leave you feeling smaller and which ones quietly expand the way you see the world. Expansion isn't comfortable. It stretches assumptions until they no longer fit. It exposes contradictions you've carefully ignored. It asks you to admit that yesterday's certainty may only have been yesterday's perspective. That's a difficult admission, not because it damages your pride, because it changes your responsibility. Once you know more, you become accountable for seeing differently. You can't honestly return to comfortable ignorance. You can imitate it. You can perform it. But somewhere inside, you'll recognize the performance. And recognition has a remarkable memory. I've begun to think awareness behaves like light entering an old room. At first, it doesn't move anything. The furniture stays exactly where it has always been. The walls don't shift. Nothing physically changes. Yet suddenly you notice the dust suspended in the air, the scratches across the floor, the details that darkness quietly protected. Light didn't create those things. It simply removed your excuse for overlooking them. Awareness does the same. It doesn't manufacture complexity. It uncovers it. That's why people often mistake honesty for discomfort. Honesty isn't painful because truth is cruel. It's painful because illusion was easier to maintain. I've caught myself searching for the version of life where everything seemed simpler. Then I realized something. Life wasn't simpler. I was paying less attention. There's an enormous difference. Attention changes reality, not by altering the world, but by revealing layers that were always present. Once you begin seeing patterns, they're everywhere. Not mystical patterns, human ones, the words people avoid, the emotions hidden beneath confidence, the exhaustion disguised as ambition, the loneliness concealed behind constant activity. We become experts at translating appearances into conclusions. Rarely do we pause long enough to wonder what remains untranslated. Everyone carries an invisible language, a vocabulary made from experiences they never fully explained, losses they stopped mentioning, dreams they quietly abandoned, promises they made only to themselves. You can spend years knowing someone and never become fluent in that language. Perhaps complete understanding isn't the point. Perhaps the point is approaching another person with enough humility to admit you'll never see the whole landscape from where you're standing. That realization changed something in me. It made certainty feel less impressive, and curiosity far more valuable. Curiosity doesn't weaken conviction. It protects conviction from becoming arrogance. There's freedom in admitting you haven't reached the final version of your understanding. It means tomorrow is still allowed to surprise you. It means growth remains possible. It means identity is alive, instead of preserved behind glass. I've stopped asking whether I'll ever fully understand myself. I'm beginning to think that's the wrong question. Maybe the better question is this: can I remain honest enough to recognize myself each time I change? Because change isn't asking permission. It never has. It's happening quietly. Through every difficult conversation, every unexpected silence, every moment that asks me to look a little deeper than I did yesterday. And perhaps that's enough. Not certainty, not completion. Just the willingness to keep walking toward a version of myself I've never met before, without demanding that the path reveal its ending before I take the next step. To be continued. There comes a point where you stop asking whether you're changing. The evidence becomes impossible to overlook. It isn't written across your face. It doesn't announce itself through dramatic decisions. It appears in the smallest moments, the conversations that no longer interest you, the silence that no longer feels empty, the opinions that once defined you but now seem like echoes from someone you almost remember. That's when you understand something most people spend years avoiding. Growth is not becoming someone else. It's becoming someone you could not have recognized before. For a long time, I believed identity was something you built once and protected forever. A finished structure, a completed design, something strong enough to survive every season without needing to be rebuilt. Now I see it differently. Identity isn't a monument. It's a landscape. Landscapes don't apologize for changing. They welcome rain. They endure drought. They lose forests. They grow new ones. The mountain remains, but every season redraws the details. Maybe people are the same. We spend so much energy protecting who we were that we forget we're supposed to become more than our previous definitions. There's a strange comfort in familiarity. Even when it limits you, even when it quietly convinces you that you've already reached your final shape, comfort rarely asks difficult questions. It tells you to remain where everything is understandable, predictable, safe, but understanding has never been born from safety alone. It grows wherever certainty becomes curious enough to examine itself. I've noticed that the strongest beliefs I've ever held weren't the ones I defended the loudest. They were the ones that survived being questioned. Anything can appear solid until it's tested. Real depth isn't measured by how confidently something stands. It's measured by how honestly it responds when the ground begins to move beneath it. That realization changed the way I listen, not only to other people, to myself. There was a time when every thought felt final. If I believed something today, I assumed tomorrow would simply confirm it. Now I leave room for revision, not because I doubt everything, because I've learned that wisdom isn't the absence of change. It's the ability to recognize when change is asking something meaningful of you. Some truths don't arrive as answers, they arrive as interruptions. They stop familiar patterns, they slow automatic reactions. They create a pause where certainty used to live. At first, those pauses feel uncomfortable. Then something unexpected happens. You begin to value them. Because within those moments exists the possibility of seeing beyond your first conclusion. I've started believing that our first interpretation of reality is rarely our deepest one. It's simply the fastest. The mind prefers speed, the heart prefers certainty, but awareness prefers patience. It waits, it watches. It refuses to reduce complexity into convenient explanations simply because convenience feels easier to carry. That kind of patience has transformed the way I experience ordinary life. The smallest moments have become impossible to ignore. A stranger smiling without expecting anything in return, an old photograph that suddenly reveals details I never noticed before. The sound of rain against a window reminding me that some forms of peace don't require words. None of these moments change the world, yet somehow they change the person observing it. Perhaps transformation has always lived inside ordinary things. Perhaps we simply move too quickly to notice. We're taught to chase milestones, achievements, destinations, as though meaning only exists where effort reaches its conclusion. But life keeps proving otherwise. Some of the most significant shifts happen while nothing remarkable appears to be taking place. You're waiting in line, walking home, looking out of a train window, and without warning, a single thought rearranges years of understanding, no applause, no witness, no celebration, just a quiet realization that tomorrow's version of you will never see today exactly the same way again. I've come to respect those moments, not because they solve everything, because they remind me that life is still capable of surprising me. That possibility matters. It keeps the future open. It prevents certainty from becoming a prison disguised as confidence. There are still questions I can't answer. Questions about purpose, about direction, about whether becoming more aware also means becoming more responsible for the lives we touch. I don't know. Maybe certainty isn't the reward for paying attention. Maybe deeper questions are. And perhaps that's enough. Not every unanswered question is evidence that something is missing. Sometimes it's evidence that you're finally asking the right ones. I've stopped measuring progress by how many answers I've collected. Instead, I notice the quality of my questions. Are they honest? Do they challenge me? Do they invite growth instead of protecting comfort? If they do, then perhaps I'm already moving in the right direction. I don't expect to arrive at a version of myself that's complete. Completion sounds strangely lifeless, as though nothing new could ever enter, nothing unexpected could ever reshape the landscape again. I don't want that. I want to remain someone capable of being changed by truth, someone who doesn't mistake familiarity for wisdom, someone willing to begin again whenever reality quietly reveals another layer I hadn't yet learned to see. Because maybe that's what living actually is, not reaching certainty, not escaping uncertainty, but continuing forward with enough humility to know that every horizon hides another one beyond it. And perhaps one day I'll look back at this version of myself the same way I now look back at every previous one, not with embarrassment, not with regret, but with gratitude. Gratitude that I kept walking even when the destination wasn't visible. Gratitude that I allowed questions to stay unanswered long enough for better answers to emerge. Gratitude that I never confused standing still with becoming whole, because if there's one thing I know now, it's this. The person I'm becoming isn't waiting for me somewhere in the future. That person is being shaped quietly through every decision to remain honest. Every moment, I choose awareness over assumption. And every step I take into the unknown without demanding certainty before I move. And maybe that's all growth has ever asked of us. Not perfection, only the courage to keep becoming.